أجمعين أما بعد فالحمد لله ثم الحمد لله. A week of Ramadan has passed. SubhanAllah, it seems like yesterday we were sitting here and we heard the first reminder on one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, who can remind me, last Saturday we took one of the names of Allah. What was that name? Shakur, mashallah. You were paying attention. MashaAllah. Ash-Shakur. What does Ash-Shakur mean? Silence. Maybe you weren't paying attention. What's Ash-Shakur? When we say Allah is Ash-Shakur, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that appreciates the efforts. He increases your small effort, He gives you great reward. He appreciates all the little that you do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ash-Shakur. Today we're going to look at another name. And that name is Al-Wakeel. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Wakeel, the trustee. What does that mean? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is relied upon. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who you entrust your affairs to. That's what it means when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Wakeel. But if I was to ask you a question, if I was to say, who do you trust? Think of a person that you trust. Think of a person that you would entrust your affairs to. Who is it that you would rely upon when you have an issue? Now, for many people, it might be a family member, it might be a parent, it might be a sibling, a spouse, it might be a best friend or a close companion that you have. But if you reflect on it, when it comes to relying upon them, when it comes to putting your trust in them, it's not absolute. Yes, it's restricted. Yes, it's specific. You won't completely trust them with all of your affairs. You wouldn't. So for example, your parents, if they've got no background in law, you're not going to be happy for your parent, your mother or your father to represent you in court. Yes, you wouldn't trust them to do that. If you've got a close friend who's an engineer, you're not going to be happy for your engineer friend, yes, to come and start giving you medical advice. And so you're an engineer, what medical advice are you giving? Yes? If you have a sibling who's a lawyer, yes, you're not going to trust him to do your accounts. Are you? You won't trust a lawyer for many things, to be honest. You're not going to trust him to do your accounts. And this is the reality of the creation. That when it comes to your trust in them, it's very limited and it's very specific. It's not absolute. But when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's not like the creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like the people. When it comes to our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we entrust all of our affairs to Allah. This is why Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, he said that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of having all matters entrusted to Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this brings us to the concept of what? Of tawakkul. Of reliance upon Allah, putting your trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ وَكِيلًا. That everything in the heavens and the earth belongs to Allah. Everything in the heavens and the earth belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is enough for those who entrust Him. Who trust in Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is enough. And when it comes to this concept of tawakkul, we have to understand that yes, it's putting your reliance in Allah, it's putting your trust in Allah, but you also must take your means. A part of trusting in Allah is that you take your means. You can't sit at home and think, you know what, money's just going to fall from the sky and take care of all of my needs. No, that's not putting trust in Allah. That's you being silly. Yes, putting your trust in Allah is that you take the means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. Yes, and then you rely upon Allah. And then you fully leave the affair to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that if you were to rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as He should be relied upon, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide for you like He provides for the bird. How does He provide for the bird? He said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the bird leaves in the morning hungry, yes, and returns what? Full. The bird leaves in the morning hungry but returns in the evening full. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides for that bird. But that bird didn't just sit in the nest and food fell down, no. The bird had to go, strive, put the effort in, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides. That's the concept of tawakkul. That's what we must understand when it comes to relying upon al-wakil, is that we put our trust in Allah and realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of our affairs. Yes, true tawakkul of Hajar alayhi salam. We just came back from Umrah and we were talking about Hajar alayhi salam. Why is it involved between Safa and Marwa? We recount the tawakkul of Hajar alayhi salam. Hajar alayhi salam is being left in the middle of a desert. Okay, think about this. No one there. She says to Ibrahim alayhi salam, are you leaving us in a place where there's no people? There's no provision. Are you going to really leave us here? Yes? And then what did she say? Allah amaraka bihada, as Allah commanded you to do this. Ibrahim alayhi salam says yes. She says then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of our affair. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of our affair. And then she goes back to her son Ismail and the provision's finished. What does she do? She doesn't say, okay, Allah's going to provide for us now, khalas. No, she starts to run between what? Between Safa and Marwa. This is the sa'i, this is the striving that we do. Between Safa and Marwa, she runs to try and find provision. She puts the effort in, she takes the means, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides the well of Zamzam. The well of Zamzam. After the effort was put in by Hajar alayhi salam. And this was the way. I mean, if you look at the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he took all the means. He would always take the means. Look at the hijrah, for example. When the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam migrates from Mecca to Medina, it's going to be a difficult journey. The Quraysh are looking for him sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He places Ali in his spot. And then he goes to the opposite direction of Medina. And then they cover the tracks. They do all of this. And subhanAllah, the Quraysh still, they come to the mountain in which the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr are hiding. And then Abu Bakr is afraid. He says that if they look down, they're going to find us. And what does the Prophet ﷺ say? لا تحزن إن الله معنا. Don't be afraid. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with us. He took the means and then he left it to the event Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Prophet ﷺ would always do this. The Battle of Badr. Yes, now around 1,000 are coming. What does the Prophet ﷺ do? He strategizes, he does shura, he places the army in specific locations, and then he puts his trust in Allah. And then he makes dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So taking the means is part and parcel of what? Of our tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now you might be thinking, what if I take the means, but I don't get the result I want? Yes, I don't get what it is that I'm asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for. Does this mean that Allah hasn't fulfilled His trust? We're saying Allah is the wakil, He's the trustee, He's the one who we put our full trust into. Does this mean that Allah has not fulfilled His trust? Of course not. I mean, this is the problem with insan. Is that we don't get what we want. What? We think that there's a problem with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ya'udhu billah. I mean, look at Yusuf alayhi salam. Yusuf alayhi salam is thrown in the well by his brothers. Yes, he's sold as a slave. He ends up in prison. Throughout all of this, does he give up on his reliance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Does he ever say, why has this happened to me? I'm putting my trust in Allah and it's going from bad to worse. What's going on? He never said that. Why? Because he knew Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-wakil. He put his trust in Allah and look what happened at the end. The same as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The year of sorrow was a difficult year for the Prophet alayhi salatu wasallam. He loses his wife. Yes, he loses his uncle. Difficulty. He goes to Ta'if and the people of Ta'if reject him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Did the Prophet ﷺ ever say, why is Allah doing this to me? How could this happen? I'm putting my trust in Allah, but it's going from bad to worse. No. The Prophet ﷺ kept that reliance. He knew Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was al-wakil. And look at what happens. After all of this, he's taken away on the night journey. He's taken to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if the people of Ta'if reject, what happens? He gets Medina. Sometimes we don't see what's coming. Yes? Sometimes we don't realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a greater plan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-wakil. So you take the means and then you leave the rest to Allah. Realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will look after your affairs. وَمَنْ يَتَوَكَّلَ عَلَى اللَّهِ فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ. Allah says in the Quran, whoever puts their trust in Allah, then Allah is sufficient for them. Allah says that. There's a story which illustrates this. I'll end on this. I know I've gone on. I was going with Sheikh Abu Yusuf yesterday, but I've gone on a bit. This story, subhanAllah, I remember reading this. There's a book called Muslims Around the World. And in there, there's a story of a sister called Hala. She says that in 1979, yes, my father, she was from Syria. My father decided to move to America. He went to America first. I was supposed to go to America later with my mother and my siblings. Okay? She says, my father's in America now, our time to travel comes. We land in New York, okay? We've got a